Well, Cornel West speaks for the global majority that understands that NATO represents 10% of the world's population, mostly a wealthy white population, and it consumes over 55% of the world's military budget. And what it uses that military budget for is aggressive action that has nothing to do with a defensive alliance protecting the North Atlantic. And what we've seen at Vilnius is NATO attempting to expand into the Indo-Pacific with a global NATO that's going to bring German troops into training sessions, 30,000 of them with Australia. They attempted to bring a command center to Tokyo, Japan, which actually rankled the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who said this has nothing to do with the North Atlantic. So what NATO is doing is actually upsetting the security architecture of Europe that prevailed before the Cold War. And it's also done so by expanding constantly towards Russian borders in violation of a stated agreement between Mihaila Gorbačova and the George H.W. Bush administration, something that none other than George Kennan, the architect of the U.S. national security state, warned would be a recipe for World War III. And here we are on the brink of that right now. Well, disbanding NATO would threaten local elites in places like Finland or Sweden who are now linking their fate to that of the United States, which is far away, rather than to their traditional partners in their own neighborhood. Finland has traditionally been a neutral country and had relations with the Soviet Union and Russia, as did Sweden. So what NATO is doing is actually forcing these countries into alliances with powerful military superpowers far away and increasing the risk of war in the neighborhood. For me, it's more interesting as it relates to Turkey, because this is a mid-level power that was playing both sides, was playing BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Group, the Eurasianist power bloc on the one hand, and NATO on the other. And Erdogan has stepped into the NATO realm to get some favors, like 18 F-16s, probably favorable visa treatment for Turkish citizens within the EU. He's not going to get EU membership. And lots of other military goodies. And this is at a time when Erdogan is under diplomatic pressure from the NATO states, accusing him of being anti-democratic. And then Sweden, what it's done is broken its historic neutrality. I don't think Russia seeks the dependence the way the United States does, simply because it doesn't have the military and economic capacity to impose its will on those countries. But it would alter their political and security infrastructure to actually have real workable treaties with their neighbors. Well, what they should do is take a look at what happened to Ukraine. Ukraine was NATOized since 2014. The U.S. implemented a coup in 2014 in Ukraine. It ran the whole thing, determined who would be in government, then it brought in hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons, fueled a civil war that pushed its way up to Russia's border and tempted a Russian invasion. Now the U.S. through NATO is going to militarize Finland right on Russia's border, 800 kilometers of border right there. Will the U.S. get involved and actually defend that border? No, because look at what it did to Ukraine. It has completely left them out in the cold. And so I think it's better for these countries to actually have treaties and to treat Europe as a power of its own, instead of to adopt this transatlanticist mentality where everything comes back to Washington, and Washington sets the so-called rules-based order, which simply means you follow the rules and we give the orders.
So the latest NATO summit just wrapped up in Lithuania, and Joe Biden celebrated by signing an executive order that will allow the Pentagon to mobilize another 3,000 reservists for deployment to Europe. So to put that into context, as antiwar.com notes, since February of 2022, Washington has deployed over 20,000 additional troops to Europe, bringing U.S. troop levels on the continent to over 100,000 for the first time since 2005. How many Americans watching this video knew that 100,000 of our troops were stationed in Europe right now? And why do you think that is? The Pentagon is justifying sending another batch of troops to the region by saying they'll be part of Operation Atlantic Resolve, which is the title that NATO has given to the troops it began sending to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland back in 2014 following the government overthrow the alliance supported in Ukraine. But of course, if you look at Western media coverage of the conflict, they completely ignore the part where the NATO alliance has spent the last 9 years increasing its troop presence near Russia's border, because this isn't a proxy war, and those forces definitely aren't being used to train troops inside Ukraine. Except that that's exactly what's happening. And we're not just seeing it in a border country where you would expect it, like Poland. We're also seeing it in the UK, where the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense documented their troops being saluted and cheered on as they left training facilities back in April. Then there's the US itself, which brought more than 100 Ukrainian troops to Oklahoma at the beginning of this year, and has since used its favorite propaganda outlets to brag about how good they're doing in their training on the Patriot missile system. Not to be forgotten, Canada has been doing some training of its own, with the president of the European Commission even revealing that Canada has been training Ukrainian troops since 2015.
In parallel, we will continue training Ukrainian soldiers like you are doing so, but you have been doing since 2015 already. Our goal is, on the European side, to train 30,000 troops by the end of the year.
If that comes as a surprise to you, well, it shouldn't, because the US and its NATO allies didn't just help overthrow the democratically elected government in Ukraine in 2014 for the fun of it. They have been trying to weaken Russia's economy and have even been preparing for a direct confrontation ever since, which is why, as a reminder, the CIA has been active in the region training Ukrainian forces since at least 2015. That revelation was made in a Yahoo News report from January 2022 that was quickly ignored by the rest of the Western media and forgotten just a few weeks later.